Everyone, and welcome to our final APUSH periods. We're looking at periods 8 and 9, and I'm going to try and see if I can get through this one rather quickly. Again, I'm just going to cover the real main highlights of these two periods. You can always pause the video at any time and look at some stuff I have there to take some notes. Again, so here are these essential questions. Now we have, 5 of them here, because there's a lot going on in period 8. Period 8 is the Cold War. So you have this thought of what are the origins of the Cold War? What are the goals of the policymakers in America at the time? How did U.S. involvement in the Cold War set up not only we think of everything that's going on in the world, but a lot of domestic, political, and social changes are going on in America at the time. The effects, the causes and the effects of economic growth and demographic changes after World War II. A massive middle class explosion, a lot of prosperity in the 1950s, early 1960s. That will be followed by a very economic down period in the 1970s. Massive civil rights movement takes place. We also see the Supreme Court and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs get very much involved, not only in the nation's politics and economic, but also the social and environmental affairs. And the civil rights movement also helps spur other activist groups such as the feminist movement, Latino movements, and Native American movements in America. These are good, essential questions because you can use these as essay topics as well. So think about these in terms of essay topics and how you would answer using period 8. So period 8 is primarily the Cold War. Much of what happens from 1945 all the way through 1992 at the end of the Cold War is going to be in the shadow of the Cold War. This is a time period basically where the United States is creating its containment policy. And every single president is going to have some form of containment. Now, I put George Kennan there. He's just an example. He's the foreign diplomat to Moscow who came up with the concept of containment policy. But if you think about it, excuse me, you have Truman begins it. Harry Truman begins his containment policy, and it goes on through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and eventually ends with Reagan. But they all will have some form of containment policy. Excuse me, as you can tell, I still have my cold. And there's a fluctuating period. There's either direct or indirect confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. In the 1970s, we do get to détente. That's Richard Nixon. We have a cooling off periods of the Cold War, but eventually it will come to an end, as we'll see in period 9 with Ronald Reagan. There's a lot of aspects of the world that's involved. Both sides are trying to seek allies. Colonization comes to an end after World War II. And Africa and Asia and parts of Latin America, and both the Soviet Union and the United States want allies. The Middle East becomes a huge area of concern for both the Soviet Union and the United States because of oil. A lot of debates in the United States over the use of federal power. Presidents become very powerful at this time period because they use the justification of the Cold War in order to gain more power. Here at home, your key concept talks about a rooting out of communism at home. McCarthyism would be the example of that. You have the House Committee of Un-American Activities, or as we like to call it, HAC, where they start to see communism everywhere, especially in the movie industry. Hollywood will get very much attacked as creating communist type of propaganda to influence young minds to turn to communism. Two wars, but they're not declared wars. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, they're more police actions, but more and more Americans begin to protest now. Americans never protested really war before. I mean, on small scale, but it starts to grow. In the Vietnam War, that's why I have it Vietnam there in parentheses, we'll see the largest rise of protests against the war and a sitting president in Johnson. In Eisenhower's farewell address, even though his farewell address, again, is not mentioned in the key concepts, it's a good example, but the expression military-industrial complex is. Think Tony Stark. Think Iron Man. If you watch the first Iron Man movie, he was making weapons of mass destruction for the United States Army. And that has taken place ever since the War of 1812 with Eli Whitney, and he had interchangeable parts. He got the first government contract to make muskets for the United States Army in the War of 1812. That's what Eisenhower points out in his farewell address. He says, in times of need, industry that, basically, and I'm paraphrasing and alluding to things, but industry that can make pots and pans and plowshares. He uses the expression make plowshares into swords, which is a biblical reference. They could make, objects of peace and turn into objects of war when necessary. But after World War II, this military-industrial complex stays permanent. It doesn't go back and just start making normal things like cars and trucks and pots and pans and computers. Now, war industry emerges after World War II, and Eisenhower gives us a warning of this, that these things will come to influence governments all over the world, and guess what? He be right. All right, so that's the military-industrial complex. Civil rights movement, a massive civil rights movement begins at this time period. Your concepts talk about this is trying to finally fulfill those Reconstruction era promises. Remember the 14th and the 15th Amendment, the right of citizenship, the right to vote. Those things in a small time period during the late 1860s, early 1870s were promised and then immediately fell apart once Reconstruction came to an end and the South began to create segregation policies. Now here we get after World War II, African Americans became very involved in World War II, and now they're going to use that experience to create and fulfill their civil rights now throughout the 50s and 60s through such things as sit-ins, peaceful assembly, and boycotts. These things, unfortunately, do often turn to violence, not because of African Americans, but because of often the whites who are not very tolerant of this, especially in the South. The massive civil rights moment is Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, where the courts became socially involved. This is the Warren Court, and they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1898. That's what created separate but equal. This dealt with public schools, though. This overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in public school systems. You must now desegregate. You must integrate the races. However, massive Southern white resistance. It will take more than 10 years before many of the Southern states will begin to, in fact, integrate their schools. We get the rise of private schools start to happen throughout Southern states, so they don't have to comply with federal law. And eventually, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is what's going to give the federal government the power to force public schools to integrate. Throughout the 50s and 60s, all the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King and his nonviolent approach to Malcolm X and the more violent approach, again, excuse me, this will also influence other activist groups, such as a feminist movement will begin. In the late 50s and throughout the 60s, Betty Friedan will write her famous book, The Feminist Mystique, where she talks about the problem that has no name, where women, the 1950s is a huge era of conformity and trying to have women go back into the homes after World War II having jobs. And it brought about this issue with women in America. They felt like they wanted more. And eventually by the 1960s, they will start their own movement. A Latino movement will happen in the late 60s and throughout the 1970s. And a massive American Indian movement will happen as well, where they'll start reclaiming their rights. And they'll use African American civil rights movement as a springboard for them. Debates over not only gender, but sexuality and ethnicity will be a huge factor of these new movements of the late 60s into the 70s and even up until our time period. Cold War and liberalism. Liberalism does not go away. The progressive era. It literally tells us in the key concepts that the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson, our fifth president mentioned by name, and his Great Society is the height of liberalism. All this social reform, again, during a time of peace. Right? This dealt with Medicare and Medicaid, education reform, immigration reform. He also had his war on poverty this time period. Again, the Supreme Court is very much involved with this as well. Such cases as the Miranda case, Miranda versus Arizona. And if I just say the word Miranda, a lot of you out there already in your mind thinking of your Miranda rights. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. You know what I mean. But no, this shows that the Supreme Court as well was very much involved in the liberal movements of the 1960s and influenced by Johnson's Great Society as well. There's also a massive economic explosion in the United States after World War II. This post-war optimism, a post-war boom and prosperity. The 1950s saw this massive growth of the middle class. A baby boom happens. More children born in the United States during this time period, the mid-1940s and early 1960s, than any other time period in America. The rise of the suburbs, which also led to conformity. You know, all these cookie-cutter houses looking the same. Everyone's going to have a television in their house. We're all going to watch the same programs. And a lot of these programs are dealing with the family and the idea that a traditional family values, right? The idea of mom stays home and cleans in a dress. Dad goes to work. The kids get in a little bit of trouble, but by the end of the show, Dad comes home and solves all the problems. And that's conformity, people. We must all be the same homogenous group of people. Of course, that also will immediately lead to opposition in the 1950s. Juvenile delinquents is what they refer to any teenager who decides to go against the system. Rock and roll becomes a massive cultural movement, also a beatnik movement, individuals who just oppose this idea of conformity. The Sun Belt refers to the southern states. Every 10 years, population grows in the South, and more people of the North are constantly moving to the South. So your political power now, from starting in the 1950s, and it has definitely solidified here in 2015, southern states have most of the power now. In fact, since Lyndon Johnson, the majority of our presidents have been from the Sun Belt. Texas and California primarily. Arkansas, Bill Clinton. You have Jimmy Carter is from Georgia. Of course, you get Barack Obama breaks that trend coming from Illinois. And you have Gerald Ford, our fake president, who was also a northerner, but you know, he was fake president. We don't count him. Massive environmental issues are raised at this time period. You even get Richard Nixon, who creates the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Americans become very involved in the environment. Gas emissions from cars, pollution. These become massive issues in the late 60s, throughout the 70s, and all the way to our time period. The 60s saw a massive counterculture movement against a lot of this liberal reform, against the conformity of the 50s. Also, a sexual revolution was part of this as well. Your hippies, your Students for a Democratic Society, your SDS, the New Left, the New Socialists in America who were college-educated individuals. All this was part of the counterculture. The rock and roll music of the 60s will definitely reflect the counterculture that happens. And again, here's a plethora of examples you can use. You can pause at any time and take a look at some of this. And if there's anything you're not sure of, oh, look at that. That messed up there. Rachel Carson should be moved over. Sorry about that. She deals with environmental issues. Maybe that's a sign that I should point that out. You might want to look up Rachel Carson, a huge environmentalist at the time period. Very important for this. All right, period 9. 2 questions here. So how have U.S. foreign policy and goals and actions evolved since the end of the Cold War? 9/11, right? 9/11 is going to change everything for us. And how have demographic changes since the 1980s affected our culture, our society, and our politics? And basically, the period 9 is a very short period. The 1970s saw a lot of loss of faith in government by the general public, political scandals such as Watergate, a massive energy crisis led to high inflation. We called this stagflation at the time period. By the end of the 70s and into the 80s, this massive religious fundamentalist movement and conservatism comes back. In the 1980s becomes the era of the conservative movement. And Ronald Reagan is now our sixth and final president mentioned by name. Starts with George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon B. Johnson, and now Ronald Reagan. Those are our six presidents only mentioned by name. Of course, Reagan and the conservatives, they come to power at this time period. Their primary goal is to cut taxes and shrink the big government of FDR's New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Begin to shrink these programs, stop a lot of government spending. Reagan also renews the Cold War by increasing spending in the military. They're going to outspend the Soviet Union, and that's one of the factors that will help end the Cold War. Remember SDI, his Star Wars program. Of course, September 11 changes everything for the United States again, much like Pearl Harbor. Remember this, Pearl Harbor changes America. Not only do we enter World War II, but America will no longer be an isolationist nation, and they become full-on interventionists. September 11 will change that as well. America is very much involved in the world when it comes to terrorism and takes a very active role. America is now part of a global economy. The whole world is a trading partner. NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, America's primary partners, Canada and Mexico. A lot of demographic changes bring about a lot of debates over, again, our traditional family. What is the gender roles in America? Gay rights, for instance. Immigration rights. Immigration becomes a huge issue in the late 1980s. And of course, if you're paying any attention here in 2015, immigration is also a big issue to this day. All right, and here are just some of your examples you can use for period 9. Bill Clinton universal health care, which did not pass, but of course today we have what is often known as Obamacare, right? The New Democrats, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Immigration Reform Act of 1986. These are all things, there's of course the 70s, there's Jimmy Carter there, and human rights. All right, that's it. I hope this went really short, and I'll see everybody later. Bye-bye.